Hey guys! Tonight we begin with something that's been puzzling people for, about 4,500 years. So go ahead, dim the lights, get comfortable, maybe grab some water you'll forget to drink. Because we're heading into the desert. And yes, it's that one. The Egyptian one. The sandy, sunburn-making, endlessly mysterious place where giant triangles casually poke out of the ground like, yeah, we're still here. You've seen them. You know the drill. The Great Pyramid of Giza, that one perfect geometry homework assignment that somehow got an A without lasers or AutoCAD. And tonight we're going to talk about how it was built, who did it, why it probably wasn't aliens, and why Pharaoh Khufu may just be history's most overconfident project manager. So, deep breath. Let's start gliding back in time. The setting. Egypt before the big blocks. Picture the Nile. Calm. Green edges, golden middle. It's around 2600 BCE, give or take a few decades, because record-keeping was mostly chisel it somewhere and hope the sand doesn't eat it. Egypt is basically the world's first organized influencer brand. Everyone's wearing linen, worshipping cats, and building tombs that scream, I have status and I am never truly dead. Before the pyramids, pharaohs were buried in things called mastabas, flat-topped mud brick rectangles that look like someone tried to make a pyramid but gave up halfway for lunch and never came back. They were fine, functional, but not exactly Instagram-worthy. Then along comes Djoser, around 2630 BCE, who apparently looked at those mastabas and said, what if we stack them? Enter the Step Pyramid, our first big architectural glow-up. His architect, Imhotep, yes, that Imhotep from The Mummy, was basically the ancient world's Tony Stark, doctor, engineer, priest, occasional overachiever. The Step Pyramid was revolutionary. People saw it and thought, wow, that's tall. Let's do even taller. And thus began Egypt's favorite long-term hobby, vertical stone collecting. Enter Khufu, the man, the myth, the overbuilder. Now we meet Khufu, also known by his Greek name Cheops, the man behind the Great Pyramid. Every culture has that ruler, the one who decides normal just isn't good enough. Khufu was that guy. Son of Snefru, grandson of another pyramid enthusiast, he inherited a family business that basically revolved around die impressively. Snefru had already built 3 pyramids, because apparently one didn't spark joy. One collapsed halfway, awkward. Another changed angle midway, like it got tired, the bent pyramid, and the third finally worked. You'd think Khufu would learn restraint from Dad's trial and error. But no, Khufu looked at the bent pyramid and said, cute, but make it monumental. Building the Great Pyramid. Let's gently float over to the main event. Roughly 2.3 million stone blocks, each averaging 2.5 tons. Some weighed up to 15 tons. And before you imagine cranes or forklifts, remember, this was 4,500 years ago. No wheels, no iron tools, just ropes, sledges, and way too many laborers with sore backs. So, how did they do it? Well, theories abound, and historians love nothing more than arguing over ramps. There's the straight ramp theory, the zigzag ramp theory, the spiral ramp theory, and my personal favorite, the we have no idea but it worked somehow theory. The straight ramp idea sounds logical until you realize it would have required more material than the pyramid itself. The spiral ramp sounds elegant until you remember turning 15-ton blocks isn't a dainty process. Most likely, it was a combination. Ramps built in sections, stones dragged on sledges lubricated with water to reduce friction. Yes, that's right. They were literally sliding into DMs. Desert movers. Ancient engineers knew what they were doing. Who built it? Spoiler, not slaves. Let's deal with a common bedtime myth. You've probably heard the pyramids were built by slaves whipped under the desert sun, chanting sad work songs. Yeah, Hollywood made that up. Archaeology says otherwise. In the 1990s, workers' villages were found near Giza, well-fed laborers, with bread, beer, and beef rations. Yes, beef, because apparently pyramid building was the ancient version of a government benefits job. They were skilled workers, farmers during the off-season, stonemasons, craftsmen, paid, organized, proud. The graffiti they left behind reads like frat house humor, the drunkards of Minkara, and the friends of Khufu. So basically construction teams with fan club energy. And before you feel too sorry for them, remember, they were getting steady meals and a lifetime of bragging rights. Yeah, that big triangle, I carried one of the cornerstones. No big deal. The pyramid as a flex. Let's talk purpose. The pyramid wasn't just a tomb. It was the ultimate power statement. Egyptians believed in the afterlife like it was an eternal corporate promotion. You died, filled out your spiritual paperwork, and, if you had enough gold, got upgraded to the field of reeds, basically heaven but with nicer agriculture. Khufu wanted to make sure no one ever forgot him. So he built the largest stone structure on Earth, one that's still here after 4 millennia, while his palace? Dust. His boats? Gone. But that tomb? Still photogenic. Inside, things were surprisingly plain. Just narrow shafts, a few chambers, and a sarcophagus that was, wait for it, too big to fit through the passageways, which means it was placed there before the pyramid was sealed. So yes, they built a 6 million-ton monument around a box, because Khufu could. The workforce logistics. Imagine organizing 20,000 to 30,000 people without Excel, walkie-talkies, or HR forms. Food came from state farms. Bread and beer were the ancient fuel of choice. Archaeologists found bakeries capable of producing thousands of loaves daily. Each worker got about 4 liters of beer a day, because nothing says safety first like tipsy stone hauling. They were skilled workers, farmers during the off-season, stonemasons, craftsmen, paid, organized, proud. The graffiti they left behind reads like frat house humor, the drunkards of Minkara, and the friends of Khufu. So basically construction teams with fan club energy. And before you feel too sorry for them, remember, they were getting steady meals and a lifetime of bragging rights. Yeah, that big triangle, I carried one of the cornerstones. No big deal. The pyramid as a flex. Let's talk purpose. The pyramid wasn't just a tomb. It was the ultimate power statement. Egyptians believed in the afterlife like it was an eternal corporate promotion. You died, filled out your spiritual paperwork, and, if you had enough gold, got upgraded to the field of reeds, basically heaven but with nicer agriculture. Khufu wanted to make sure no one ever forgot him. So he built the largest stone structure on Earth, one that's still here after 4 millennia, while his palace? Dust. His boats? Gone. But that tomb? Still photogenic. Inside, things were surprisingly plain. Just narrow shafts, a few chambers, and a sarcophagus that was, wait for it, too big to fit through the passageways, which means it was placed there before the pyramid was sealed. So yes, they built a 6 million-ton monument around a box, because Khufu could. The workforce logistics. Imagine organizing 20,000 to 30,000 people without Excel, walkie-talkies, or HR forms. Food came from state farms. Bread and beer were the ancient fuel of choice. Archaeologists found bakeries capable of producing thousands of loaves daily. Each worker got about 4 liters of beer a day, because nothing says safety first like tipsy stone hauling. They were skilled workers, farmers during the off-season, stonemasons, craftsmen, paid, organized, proud. The graffiti they left behind reads like frat house humor, the drunkards of Minkara, and the friends of Khufu. So basically construction teams with fan club energy. And before you feel too sorry for them, remember, They were getting steady meals and a lifetime of bragging rights. Yeah, that big triangle, I carried one of the cornerstones. No big deal. The pyramid as a flex. Let's talk purpose. The pyramid wasn't just a tomb. It was the ultimate power statement. Egyptians believed in the afterlife like it was an eternal corporate promotion. You died, filled out your spiritual paperwork, and, if you had enough gold, got upgraded to the field of reeds, basically heaven but with nicer agriculture. Khufu wanted to make sure no one ever forgot him. So he built the largest stone structure on Earth, one that's still here after 4 millennia, while his palace? Dust. His boats? Gone. But that tomb? Still photogenic. Inside, things were surprisingly plain. Just narrow shafts.
The Mystery of the Pyramids, Part 2, where the mummies got weird. Egypt's most dramatic pharaohs. Hey guys, welcome back. If you're still awake, impressive. Most people would have dozed off somewhere between the sand and the limestone. But if you're here, we're moving forward in time. Egypt's pyramids are still standing tall, but the pharaohs inside them, let's just say they started getting a bit strange. The Old Kingdom had been golden. Smooth stones, big dreams, divine kingship. But then things wobbled. Famine, rebellion, power struggles, basically ancient Egypt's version of a midlife crisis. And when things finally got rolling again, the new pharaohs were, well, a little eccentric, a little too into family, a little too into themselves. Let's start with one of the boldest weirdos of them all, Akhenaten, the pharaoh who rebranded God. Akhenaten wasn't content to rule Egypt. He wanted to redefine reality. His birth name was Amenhotep IV, but halfway through his reign, he pulled a full spiritual rebrand. He decided Egypt didn't need its comforting buffet of gods anymore. No more Osiris, no more Isis, no more Ra sun chariot shenanigans. Nope. Akhenaten said, "We're doing minimalism now. One god only." That god was Aten, the literal sun disk. A circle in the sky, the OG minimalist logo. So Amenhotep IV changed his name to Akhenaten, meaning effective for Aten, and basically declared monotheism 3,000 years before anyone else thought it was cool. He closed temples, fired priests, and moved the capital to a brand new city, Amarna. Why build a new city? Because of course he did. Pharaohs love a vanity project. But unlike Khufu's timeless pyramid, Akhenaten's city was more of a sandcastle situation. Half-finished, uncomfortable, and not exactly enduring. His look, the "what's going on here" pharaoh. If you've seen statues or busts of Akhenaten, you've probably noticed something off. Elongated face, narrow shoulders, wide hips, belly out, almond eyes that look a little too dreamy. Egyptologists have debated his appearance for decades. Was it artistic style? Was he actually shaped like that? Or was the sculptor just tired of pretending pharaohs had perfect abs? Some theories suggest genetic conditions, Marfan syndrome, Froelich syndrome, or even familial inbreeding quirks. Others say it was all symbolic, representing the pharaoh as a fusion of male and female divine energy. Because, symbolism makes everything more confusing. Either way, Akhenaten's reign looked less like traditional Egypt and more like ancient performance art. Temples were open air, filled with sunlight, hymns praised Aten as the one who gives breath. And the art? Suddenly everyone looked relaxed, with slouchy poses, affection, and belly folds. It was all very bohemian. And then there was Nefertiti, his famously beautiful queen, name meaning the beautiful one has come. She definitely came, saw, and probably managed most of the actual work while Akhenaten wrote poetry to the sun. Together, they had 6 daughters and a PR obsession. Their family scenes are carved everywhere. the royal couple cuddling kids under Aten's rays. It's domestic, tender, and just a bit creepy in repetition. But power behind the eyeliner? Nefertiti might have ruled on her own near the end, possibly under the name Neferuaten. Or, depending on which dusty fragment you ask, she may have died early, and Akhenaten replaced her with someone else. Egyptology is 70% sand and 30% guessing. The great religion experiment ends badly. Akhenaten's monotheistic revolution lasted about as long as a bad streaming service trial. After his death, Egypt collectively went, "Yeah, that was weird," and switched back to the old gods as fast as you can say cancel subscription. His city was abandoned, his name was scratched off monuments, priests returned to power, and within a decade, almost no one remembered Aten worship. But here's the fun twist. His young successor was none other than Tutankhaten, soon renamed Tutankhamun. Yes, that Tutankhamun, the boy king, the brand ambassador for mummification itself. Tutankhamun was basically the cleanup act after Dad's theological meltdown. He became pharaoh at 9, which is of course the perfect age for absolute power. His first official decree was probably something like, "Bring back the old gods and maybe some toys." He restored Amun to the top of the divine food chain, moved the capital back to Thebes, and spent most of his short life trying to pretend Akhenaten hadn't happened. But poor Tutankhamun was not exactly built for longevity. Modern CT scans and DNA studies have shown he was frail. Club-footed, cleft palate with necrosis in his leg bones. Genetic tests even revealed the likely cause: generations of royal inbreeding. His parents were siblings, which in ancient Egypt was apparently considered romantic. He had malaria too, because when it rains, it really pours. And yet, despite being one of the least effective rulers, he became the most famous, thanks to a tomb that somehow escaped ancient looters and modern real estate developers. The tomb that broke archaeology. When Howard Carter uncovered Tutankhamun's tomb in 1922, it was basically the ancient world's version of a viral drop. Gold everywhere, masks, chariots, sandals, even beds shaped like cows, which feels like overkill for someone who ruled for 9 years. The discovery also birthed the infamous Curse of the Pharaoh. Reporters needed drama, and a few coincidental deaths made for great copy. The truth probably just mold, mosquitoes, and early 20th century hygiene. But the curse legend stuck, because apparently the best PR move Tutankhamun ever made was dying quietly and letting others handle marketing. His mummy revealed everything: his age, around 19, his deformities, and the likely infection that finally did him in. His golden mask, meanwhile, became a global icon, which, let's be honest, is one heck of a posthumous glow-up. Royal DNA drama. Modern science keeps dragging the ancient royals back into the spotlight. When geneticists analyzed mummies from Akhenaten's line, it turned into a reality show. Everyone was related to everyone else. Pharaohs married sisters, nieces, cousins, basically anyone who shared a bloodline and a mailing address. Why? Because divine blood was sacred, and heaven forbid they dilute it with mere mortals. The result? Centuries of hereditary conditions, brittle bones, and awkward family dinners where everyone probably looked identical. If there was ever a royal Tinder in ancient Egypt, the algorithm would just say, "You're all a match," unfortunately. Ramses II, the pharaoh who refused to retire. Now, let's float ahead a few centuries. The Amarna weirdness has faded, gods are stable again, and along comes Ramses, also known as Ramses the Great, the overachiever of ancient Egypt. If Khufu was the great builder and Akhenaten the great eccentric, Ramses was the great everything. He ruled for 66 years, fathered over 100 children, built more temples than anyone else, and plastered his face on half of them. Ramses was the human equivalent of a limited edition collector's item, self-branded, endlessly promoted, and remarkably well preserved. His best-known project? Abu Simbel, the massive rock temple with 4 colossal statues of, well, himself, each one 20 meters tall, because subtlety is for peasants. The battle that wasn't exactly a win. Ramses' most famous military venture was the Battle of Kadesh against the Hittites. He claimed it was a glorious victory. Wall carvings show him charging alone into battle, shooting arrows while his army just sort of, well, watches. In reality, it was a stalemate. Both sides eventually signed what's considered the world's first peace treaty. Ramses then had the results carved into stone, heavily edited for personal PR. So yes, even ancient rulers had a spin department. His mummy's afterlife tour. When Ramses finally died in his 90s, which is basically immortal by ancient standards, he got mummified and laid to rest with all due ceremony. Then centuries later, robbers came, priests rewrapped him, and eventually his mummy ended up in a museum wearing a passport. Yes, really. When Egypt sent Ramses' mummy to France in 1976 for preservation work, they issued it an official Egyptian passport listing occupation as king, deceased. You can't make that up. Bureaucracy never dies. Royal vanity through the ages. By the time the New Kingdom faded, Egypt's rulers had perfected the art of divine ego. They weren't just kings, they were gods on earth. Curators of cosmic order, owners of enough gold to make Fort Knox look minimalist. They built colossal statues.
The Mystery of the Pyramids. Part 3. When Europe Caught the Inbreeding Bug. The Habsburg Collection. Hey guys. Welcome back to another quiet chapter of historical dysfunction. Tonight's story doesn't take place under Egyptian suns, but under the heavy velvet drapes of European palaces, where chandeliers sparkled, wigs got taller, and genetics slowly gave up. If the pharaohs were divine by claim, the Habsburgs were divine by repetition. They ruled half of Europe for centuries, kept marrying their cousins, and ended up looking like what happens when you copy a family photo too many times. So, tuck yourself in. We're heading into the world of royal portraits that got weirder with each generation, where crowns were hereditary, but so were jaw problems. The Habsburg Origin Story. Power by Marriage. The Habsburg dynasty began modestly enough around the 11th century in what's now Switzerland. They were just local lords with a castle on a hill, the Habsburg, meaning Hawk's Castle. Cute, right? By the late Middle Ages, they'd realized war was messy, but weddings were efficient. Their family motto could have been, "Let others fight, you just marry." And they married. They wove themselves into every royal house in Europe, Austria, Spain, Hungary, Bohemia, even Mexico, for a brief, confusing moment. But by the 16th century, their family tree looked less like a tree and more like a circular diagram. Meet the jaw, a family trademark. The Habsburg jaw became their most famous feature, that protruding lower lip and long chin, perfectly preserved in oil paint. It wasn't just aesthetic. The condition, known as mandibular prognathism, made speech and eating difficult. But in portraits, it screamed, "I'm noble and genetically committed."
The Mystery of the Pyramids. Part 4. Sad, Sickly, and Spoiled. A Guide to Medieval Royal Children. Welcome back, time traveler. Tonight's story doesn't have pyramids or palaces quite yet, just cold stone nurseries, velvet cribs, and nurses who smelled like wine and politics. Because if you thought being a medieval king was tough, try being a medieval baby. Half of them didn't make it past age 5. The other half grew up to start wars, marry cousins, or invent new ways to die tragically. So, grab your blanket. We're visiting the royal playroom, where every rattle came with a title and every lullaby had political implications. 1. Royal birth. The world's loudest event. Being born royal in the Middle Ages wasn't private. Forget peaceful hospital rooms, childbirth was basically a state spectacle. When a queen went into labor, half the court showed up to watch. Why? Because they had to verify that the baby was real and not swapped with a peasant infant in a suspiciously clean blanket. Imagine giving birth with 20 nobles standing around, all whispering about your breathing technique. If the baby cried, the courtiers cheered like it had scored a goal. If it didn't, well, they called in priests, physicians, and possibly a witch. 2. The naming ceremony. More politics, less parenting. Once the poor newborn survived day 1, it was time for baptism, a royal PR event disguised as a ritual religion. The baby's name wasn't chosen for cuteness, it was chosen for strategy. Kings named their sons after legendary ancestors to sound legitimate, and their daughters after rich aunts who could provide dowries. For example, a French prince might be named Louis again, because apparently there was a royal shortage of imagination. A Spanish princess might be Isabella, Maria, or Maria Isabella Margarita of 3 holy somethings. Meanwhile, peasants just named their kids after the weather or vegetables. But hey, their babies didn't have to marry someone they'd never met at age 12. 3. The royal nursery. Cold walls and hot soup. Forget cozy baby rooms. Royal nurseries were drafty stone chambers where the main toys were wooden swords and fear of God. Royal babies were mostly raised by wet nurses because queens had more pressing duties, like conceiving the next one. The nurse wasn't just feeding the child, she was raising the future ruler, and sometimes that future ruler ended up loving her more than his own mother, which made awkward palace drama later when the wet nurse tried to give the king advice during war meetings. 4. Early education. Latin, chess, and existential dread. From around age 5, royal kids started their education because who doesn't want to study Aristotle before learning to spell their name? Their tutors were monks or scholars who believed in discipline through boredom. Lessons included Latin, the universal language of diplomacy and confusion. History, mostly family propaganda. Religion, to remind them that God was basically their HR manager. Sword training, because you never know when diplomacy fails. Girls, if they were lucky, got lessons in manners, embroidery, and how to look valuable without talking too much. 5. The mini-adult phase. By age 10, most royal kids were already treated like adults. Princes were sent to foreign courts as guests, which was polite code for hostages of diplomacy. Princesses were already being betrothed to men twice their age, or thrice, depending on how desperate their fathers were for land. One English princess was engaged at age 4. By the time she learned how to read, her fiancé had already died of gout. But that was okay. They just reassigned her to his brother. Medieval dating was nothing if not efficient. 6. Health. A royal mess. Despite being wrapped in gold cloth and guarded by armies, royal children were constantly sick. Why? Because no one understood hygiene. Doctors prescribed leeches for fevers, mercury for rashes, and bleeding for pretty much everything else. Some princes died of smallpox before their first birthday. Others survived but carried lifelong illnesses, like King Henry VI of England, who suffered from what modern historians suspect was schizophrenia. Or Ivan the Terrible, whose childhood trauma was so intense that it could have powered 3 Netflix series. The average medieval royal lifespan? If you made it to 20, congratulations, you were practically immortal. 7. The destiny problem. Imagine being told at age 7 that God himself chose you to rule millions. Now imagine also being told you can't go outside and make friends with commoners. That's how royal kids grew up, isolated, paranoid, and surrounded by servants who never said no. Some handled it well. Others, like Louis XIV, built massive palaces just to make sure nobody ignored them. And a few, like Richard II, went full drama queen and started executing people who looked at them the wrong way. Royal childhood was less storybook and more psychological experiment with crowns. 8. Famous royal kids who didn't make it. Let's light a tiny imaginary candle for some of history's saddest royal kiddos. Edward V of England, one of the princes in the Tower, disappeared mysteriously in 1483, likely murdered by his uncle Richard III. Family reunions were awkward after that. Tsarevich Alexei Romanov, heir to the Russian Empire, suffered from hemophilia and was executed with his family in 1918. Don Carlos of Spain, son of Philip II, locked up for mental instability and conspiracy. His life was so tragic that even opera composers said, "Let's make it sadder." And yet, each of these kids was once a royal baby cooed over by half the continent. History doesn't do happy endings. It just writes longer footnotes. 9. The spoiled ones. Power without limits. Of course, not all royal kids suffered. Some were spoiled to the point of myth. Caligula, Roman emperor by 25, grew up thinking he was literally divine. His parents called him Little Boots, and the army adored him. Then he grew up, made his horse a senator, and demanded people worship him as a god. King John of England, the villain from Robin Hood, was another classic royal spoil. His tantrums over taxes and toys matured into wars and executions. He lost half his kingdom, but gained centuries of bad PR. Lesson learned? Too much gold, not enough hugs.
10. When well kids played war. Playtime wasn't dolls and mud pies, it was mock duels and strategy games that occasionally turned real. Young princes practiced jousting, falconry, and mock battles. Sometimes those mock battles resulted in broken bones or, occasionally, early coronations. Even royal toys had symbolism. Miniature thrones, tiny swords, and dolls dressed like peasants so they could practice oppressing them young. No pressure, just a 5-year-old pretending to rule the world before breakfast. 11. The few who broke the mold.
The Mystery of the Pyramids. Part 5. Queens, Poison, and Power. The Deadliest Women in History. Hey there, night scholars. Welcome back to our little insomnia-friendly corner of history, where ambition wears perfume and betrayal comes in a jeweled cup. Tonight, we're floating through palaces and poison cabinets, where queens ruled not with swords, but with glances sharp enough to draw blood. Forget fairy tale damsels. These were women who survived centuries of dynastic chaos, arranged marriages, and men named Henry. So, relax. Dim the lights. Let's stroll through the candle-lit corridors of power. 1. Cleopatra VII, the last pharaoh standing. We'll start, of course, with Cleopatra, because every conversation about powerful women eventually ends up in ancient Egypt, somewhere between eyeliner and empire. Cleopatra wasn't the myth Hollywood sold. She wasn't a goddess, and she definitely wasn't white marble. She was Macedonian Greek by blood, Egyptian by branding, and politically lethal by instinct. When her brother husband, yes, both, tried to edge her out of power, she smuggled herself into Julius Caesar's palace, rolled up in a carpet. A bold choice. I mean, most people knock. The Mystery of the Pyramids. Part 6. The Cursed Thrones. Dynasties that destroyed themselves. Hey, Night Scholars. Welcome back. If you're still with me, you're officially in the Insomnia Club of history lovers. Tonight, the dynasties we'll meet didn't just stumble. They tripped over their own crowns, rolled down the halls of palaces, and somehow took entire empires with them. Some historians call them cursed. Others call them the results of terrible family planning and zero boundaries. We're going to wander gently through their tragic, absurd, and mildly horrifying stories. 1. The Fall of the Spanish Habsburgs. We left the Spanish Habsburgs with Charles II, frail, drooling, and genetically overwhelmed. Let's slow dance a little more with that decline. Charles II was meant to continue a dynasty that ruled Spain, the Netherlands, Naples, Sicily, and more. Instead, he died at 38, childless, after decades of illness. His death didn't just end a family line. It triggered the War of the Spanish Succession, where half of Europe decided it was a good idea to fight over someone who couldn't chew properly. The Spanish Habsburg Empire fell apart not because of external enemies, but because nature, genetics, and bad luck had finally had enough. 2. The Romanovs of Russia. Shift now to Russia, a land of snow, vodka, and dynasties with self-destruct buttons. The Romanovs began in 1613 and ruled for 3 centuries. They survived Mongols, revolutions, palace coups, and a general tendency for European nobles to overthink everything. But their downfall was, in hindsight, almost predictable. By 1917, Nicholas II was surrounded by yes-men, mystics, and a hemophiliac heir. Alexei, the Tsarevich, had hemophilia, inherited from his grandmother, Queen Victoria, whose genes were busy spreading misery across Europe. The family's reliance on Rasputin to heal the boy only fueled scandal, mistrust, and palace drama. By March 1917, the February Revolution happened. Nicholas abdicated. By July, the entire family was executed quietly in a basement. A dynasty that had survived wars, uprisings, and frost-bitten winters ended because a mystical man couldn't keep the peasants happy. 3. The Stuarts of England and Scotland. The Stuart dynasty gives us drama, Protestant Catholic tension, and a hint that karma has a very dry humor. James I, previously James VI of Scotland, inherited England in 1603. He united crowns, but not cultures, and had a penchant for writing books on kingly behavior, advice no one asked for. His son, Charles I, inherited a kingdom of restless subjects and promptly decided, Parliament? Who needs them? This led to the English Civil War, a king who was headed, and the brief experiment in republicanism under Oliver Cromwell. Then came James II, who was Catholic in a country suspicious of priests and rosaries. His attempts to secure his throne led to the Glorious Revolution and a rather polite eviction, all without a single guillotine. The Stuarts' lesson: misreading public opinion and underestimating Parliament is a surprisingly consistent path to irrelevance. 4. The Bourbons and French Revolution. France, with its powdered wigs and perfume salons, provides perhaps the most theatrical self-destruction story. Louis XVI, raised to think absolute monarchy was a lifelong spa retreat, inherited a bankrupt treasury, debt, and a population that had grown tired of bread shortages. Marie Antoinette, by birth Austrian, became the public face of extravagance, whether or not she deserved it. The couple tried reforms, half-heartedly, and somehow thought decorum would stop revolutionary mobs. It didn't. By 1793, the monarchy was over.
their heads rolling in rhythm to a very unforgiving drum. The Bourbon lesson? Privilege without insight tends to be short-lived. 5. The Ming Dynasty and fiscal madness. Let's drift east again, to China, a civilization with remarkable continuity and dynasties that lasted centuries until mismanagement, corruption, and natural disasters intervened. The Ming Dynasty had seen prosperous emperors, naval explorations, and city walls large enough to be visible from the moon. Almost. But by the late 16th and early 17th centuries, the court became obsessed with eunuchs, elaborate rituals, and taxation schemes that made peasants cry into rice balls. Famine, rebellion, and a general sense that the emperor might be out of touch led to the Manchu invasion, ending the Ming Dynasty in 1644. Even powerful empires can't outrun bad accounting. 6. The Ottoman decline, a dynasty that overextended. Now, the Ottoman Empire, a dynasty that lasted over 6 centuries, stretching from Hungary to Arabia. Sultans were absolute rulers, often marrying within the harem and promoting sons based on fear, intrigue, or lottery. Succession wars were a family sport. Brothers often fought to the death for the throne, literally. By the 17th century, the empire's golden age ended. Weak sultans, corrupt viziers, and European rivals slowly chipped away at power. Despite military genius, infrastructure, and rich culture, the dynasty eventually collapsed in the early 20th century. Cautionary tale: sometimes overextension and family squabbles are enough to dismantle centuries of domination. 7. Patterns of dynasty collapse. When we look at all these examples, Habsburgs, Romanovs, Stuarts, Bourbons, Ming, Ottomans, some patterns emerge. Inbreeding and genetics, often leading to fragile heirs, mental instability, or infertility. Poor succession planning, when kings and emperors died unexpectedly, the next in line often wasn't prepared. Over-reliance on advisors. Court intrigue could either stabilize or destroy a reign. Neglect of public opinion, a recurring theme from France to England. Financial mismanagement. Empires can survive battles, but rarely bad economics. Basically, empires are like fine china. One bad decision, and centuries of craftsmanship can shatter. 8. Tragic irony. Power versus survival. Many rulers who destroyed their own dynasties were otherwise brilliant. Napoleon's relatives? Overreaching but talented. Mughal emperors? Cultural geniuses with terrible luck in succession. The takeaway is being smart isn't enough if your family tree looks like spaghetti and your advisors can't be trusted. History has a quiet way of reminding us that power is temporary, even when it comes in gold, silk, and crowns. 9. The slow fade. By the time these dynasties finally fell, most were already ghosts in waiting. Palaces decayed, gold was stolen, thrones sat empty. Yet their stories remain, cautionary tales for historians, storytellers, and insomnia enthusiasts. They remind us that no dynasty, no however divine it feels at the time, can escape time, genetics, or simple human error. 10. Closing drift. So as we float back from European courts, Russian palaces, Chinese imperial halls, and Ottoman minarets, remember, cursed thrones are less about magic and more about human nature. Ambition, mismanagement, family squabbles, and bad health make dynasties collapse, inevitably, quietly, and sometimes spectacularly. In the quiet of history, dynasties vanish, not in battles or fires, but in the slow ticking of decisions, diseases, and bad luck. Rest easy, Night Scholars.
The crowns are empty, the halls are silent, and for a little while we can watch history from the comfort of our blankets. Tragic, absurd, and endlessly fascinating.
The Mystery of the Pyramids. Part 7. Every time royal marriages went genetically wrong.
The Mystery of the Pyramids. Part 8. The World's Most Dysfunctional Kings and Queens.
The Mystery of the Pyramids, Part 9. Sad, Sickly, and Spoiled. A Guide to Medieval Royal Children. Hey, Night Scholars! Welcome back. Tonight, we revisit a world of drafty stone nurseries, wet nurses, and royal toddlers whose every sneeze was a national concern. It's cozy, it's tragic, and it's absurd. Because even as tiny humans, these kids were trapped in dynasties, laws, and expectations they couldn't possibly understand. 1. Royal birth as public theater. Medieval royal birth was anything but private. Courtiers, priests, and distant nobles attended, ostensibly to witness legitimacy, mostly to make sure the newborn wasn't secretly a peasant swapped at the last minute. If the baby cried, it was celebrated. If the baby didn't, alarms were raised, and physicians or priests were summoned. In short, childbirth was a spectacle, and royal infants were audience-tested before they even learned to crawl. 2. Naming and destiny. Once the newborn survived, a baptism or christening cemented their social role. Names were carefully chosen. Princes often inherited the names of ancestors to signal legitimacy. Princesses were named after wealthy aunts or influential relatives to secure dowries and alliances. Cutest baby names? Rarely. Politically useful? Always. 3. Nurseries that weren't cozy. Royal nurseries were cold, drafty chambers with minimal comfort. Toys were limited. Wooden swords, horses, or educational objects designed to teach power, not play. Wet nurses raised children while queens prepared for future pregnancies. Sometimes children bonded more with their nurses than their parents, which created subtle palace tensions later. 4. Early education, drill, discipline, and Latin. By age 5, royal children began formal education. Latin for diplomacy and bureaucracy, history for moral and political lessons, religion to instill obedience, martial training for future warfare. Girls often learned etiquette, needlework, and household management, emphasizing appearance and usefulness in arranged marriages. 5. Childhood as mini-adult life. By age 10, most royal children were already mini-adults. Princes sent to foreign courts as hostages or political pawns, princesses betrothed, often to much older men. Friendships with peers were rare, and play was often indistinguishable from politics or warfare practice. 6. Fragile health. Royal children were constantly sick. Physicians relied on leeches, mercury, and other ineffective treatments. Diseases like smallpox, measles, or influenza were deadly. Surviving childhood often meant living with chronic conditions, mental or physical. Even gold and velvet couldn't prevent fragile dynasties from collapsing. 7. Pressure of destiny. Imagine being told at 7 that God chose you to rule millions. Freedom, play, and childhood were luxuries these kids couldn't afford. Some adapted, like Louis XIV, who later built Versailles. Others, like Richard II, became unpredictable or violent rulers. Royal childhood often created trauma that shaped the future of entire nations. 8. Famous examples. Edward V of England, one of the princes in the Tower, disappeared mysteriously. Tsarevich Alexei Romanov, a hemophiliac heir, executed with his family. Don Carlos of Spain, imprisoned and executed due to mental instability. These children remind us that even immense privilege couldn't shield them from tragedy. 9. Spoiled royals. Some children were spoiled in ways that encouraged dysfunction. Caligula, indulged by family and courtiers, became erratic as an emperor. King John of England, who grew up in luxury, developed destructive behavior as a ruler.
Gold, tutors, and indulgence did not guarantee wisdom or competence. 10. Play and preparation for power. Royal play often mimicked war and politics. Miniature swords, dolls dressed as peasants, and mock battles trained children to command, conquer, or negotiate before adolescence. It was less childhood and more preparation for lifelong performance. 11. Rare success stories. Some royal children survived the trauma and chaos to become effective rulers. Elizabeth I, independent and clever. Akbar the Great, a teenage emperor who expanded India's cultural and military influence. Frederick the Great, who survived personal trauma to become a brilliant strategist. These rare examples show resilience amid dynastic dysfunction. 12. Loneliness of royal childhood. Even the lucky ones were often lonely. Friendships, love, and freedom were filtered through politics. They were surrounded by people, yet truly alone. Royal children were heirs to empires, not to normal childhoods. Closing drift. As candlelight flickers, imagine the nursery again. Babies cooing under banners, wet nurses bustling. Tiny royals unaware that their every sneeze and tear shaped the fate of nations. History remembers crowns, not cribs, and these children, fragile and spoiled, were the quiet architects of dynastic destiny.
The Mystery of the Pyramids, Part 10. Every time royal marriages went genetically wrong, Part 2. Hey, Night Scholars, welcome back. By now you're probably halfway to Dreamland, which is perfect, because tonight we'll wander gently through a forest of family trees that resemble tangled spaghetti more than orderly dynasties. Royal marriages were meant to consolidate power, secure alliances, and prevent wars. Instead, they sometimes produced tiny dynasts who were frail, strange, or otherwise perfect examples of why genetics cannot be ignored. 1. The Spanish Habsburgs, beyond Charles II. We've mentioned Charles II, but let's float a little wider. The Spanish Habsburgs repeatedly married first cousins, nieces, and distant relatives. Their goal: preserve a pure bloodline. Result? Jaw deformities, infertility, and fragile health throughout the lineage. Even healthy offspring could carry subtle genetic weaknesses. Charles II's ancestors, generation after generation, were walking warnings in velvet and crowns. By the time he was born, he inherited decades of concentrated Habsburg DNA, a living testament to dynastic obsession. 2. The Austrian Habsburgs. Crossing over to Austria, we find similar patterns. Marriages between cousins were common. Children often had mental or physical impairments. Despite these issues, the family retained power, partly because the Habsburg name carried immense influence. This combination of political genius and biological misfortune is a recurring theme. 3. Portugal and Spain. Iberian cousin obsession. The Iberian Peninsula produced some of Europe's most entwined royal families. Cousins, uncles, aunts, nearly everyone married within a small circle of aristocrats. Children were often sickly or infertile, which caused repeated dynastic crises. It's easy to see why historians describe this as genetic roulette in velvet. 4. The Valois and Bourbons. Back in France, the Valois and Bourbon dynasties also embraced cousin marriages. Mental instability in Charles IX likely had a genetic component. Louis XIV and Louis XV's lines produced heirs with fragile health.
These dynastic choices made France vulnerable to succession crises and public unrest. Politics might have inspired the marriages, but biology had its own rules. 5. Queen Victoria, Europe's genetic matriarch. Fast forward a few centuries, Queen Victoria of England married her first cousin, Prince Albert. Their 9 children carried genetic traits throughout Europe. Hemophilia, known as the royal disease, spread to Spain, Russia, and Germany. The Russian Romanovs, Spanish Bourbons, and German princes all owe at least some genetic quirks to Victoria's decision. A reminder that even in the 19th century, dynastic ambition often ignored biology. 6. Hemophilia and dynastic consequences. Hemophilia provides a vivid case study. Alexei Romanov, heir to the Russian throne, suffered his entire life. European royal marriages inadvertently spread the disease, causing political anxiety and reliance on mystical figures like Rasputin. Medical science of the time was helpless, making royal children and dynasties fragile. It's a slow, tragic ripple, one genetic mutation influencing politics across continents. 7. Mental illness and inbreeding. Some rulers developed mental health issues exacerbated by inbreeding. Charles II of Spain had both physical and cognitive impairments. Other European royals, less extreme, still suffered mood disorders, physical frailty, or reduced fertility. Courtiers and advisors often had to compensate, running governments while children struggled to survive childhood or adolescence. 8. Unintended political fallout. These genetic problems had consequences beyond nurseries. Dynasties died out unexpectedly. Wars broke out over succession. Courtiers schemed to control weak heirs. Royal marriages weren't just family matters. They could shape the fate of entire nations. 9. Patterns and lessons. Across centuries, a few patterns emerge. Close kin marriages were common for power, but disastrous for health. Physical and mental impairments were often normalized or ignored. Dynastic crises frequently followed fragile births, early deaths, or infertile rulers. Genetic traits could spread across multiple royal houses, leaving a continental ripple effect. Even the richest courts couldn't escape nature's laws. 10. The human cost. Royal children were raised to represent dynasties, not individuals. They endured harsh education, illness, and isolation. Their physical and mental struggles were often ignored, hidden, or politicized. Dynastic ambition came at a personal cost: fragile children, short lives, and relentless pressure to survive. 11. Closing drift. So, as we drift past palaces, nurseries, and cradles, imagine the quiet tragedy of royal children. Tiny dynasts with crowns too heavy for their shoulders. Families obsessed with alliances and purity. History shaped as much by DNA as by battlefields or treaties. Royal genetics remind us that even absolute power cannot override biology.